How did a person at Skara Brae get through a Stone Age winter night when the last household load was still outside and the hearth could not simply be made larger? You begin with a vessel that has chosen this moment to feel as though it contains a respectable portion of Orkney. If this kind of evening honestly helps, quietly like or subscribe and share where you are listening in your local time. Let your room grow dim, settle comfortably, and come inland beside a freshwater loch in Neolithic Orkney. It is a dark winter evening, roughly 5,000 years ago. You stand outside the stone-built settlement with the final vessel and a low covered passage between you and the central hearth. The task is simple: carry it home, keep the fire steady without thick smoke, check the stores and resting places, and settle the household before the worst cold. The open ground is not a beach in your time. The sea lies farther away, beyond dunes and the freshwater landscape around the settlement, so no Atlantic spray reaches this doorway. What reaches you is the ordinary northern dark, a damp outer covering, and the awkward weight of the vessel against your hip. You shift it higher and turn toward the nearest covered route. The passage is built for protection rather than display. Flat slabs rise on either side, and roofing stones close much of the space above. Clay and turf may cover those passage slabs, as later excavation suggests for this phase of the village. The result is a route between houses that does not require every journey to cross fully open ground. It is also low. You bend before the stone can remind you. One hand steadies the vessel while the other finds the wall. The first few steps are familiar, yet familiarity does not make a narrow turn wider. Your shoulder passes, the rim passes, the bottom of the vessel comes last, close enough to the wall that you hear a faint scrape but feel no crack. That is the first small success of the evening. The load is inside the linked settlement, and the route ahead is darker, narrower, and considerably kinder than the open air. The sheltered turn does not remove the cold. It changes the journey from open exposure into a careful movement through walls already known by touch. You take the next bend slowly. The roofed passage is not a secret tunnel, and the houses were not originally buried chambers. Buildings changed through time, and deposits gathered around them, but the route still has the close, protected feeling created by stone on both sides and slabs overhead. A footstep sounds from ahead. Another adult appears with a smaller container tucked against the body. There is no room for a confident meeting. Both of you stop, each person calculating who can reverse with the least damage to supper, dignity and toes. The other load is lighter, but its carrier stands closer to a side opening. You tip your vessel a little. The neighbor turns sideways, and the two of you pass with the deliberate grace of people who have performed this negotiation many times. The right of way belongs to whoever is least able to retreat without dropping dinner. No word survives from such an exchange. The connected passages tell us that people moved between houses at close quarters, not the rules they used while doing it. Courtesy is a modest inference because some method had to keep bodies and loads from colliding. The neighbor disappears around the bend. You straighten as far as the roof permits, adjust your grip, and continue toward the warmest patch of dim light. Your free hand brushes the passage wall. Thin-facing slabs meet a deeper body of packed material behind them. Modern descriptions often call the mass around the houses midden, but the deposits are more complicated than one enormous refuse heap. Clay, sand, ash, animal bone, occupation waste, and other material accumulated in different ways and at different times. Here, the practical effect is close to your palm. The facing stone is firm. The material behind it fills space, supports the wall, and contributes to the sheltered thickness around the root. It would be easy to turn that into a modern performance claim, complete with invented temperatures. The evidence does not allow it. What it allows is simpler. The builders used layered stone and packing, and the passage feels less exposed than the open ground you have just left. You move your hand forward until it finds the next joint. Nothing shifts. The vessel remains balanced. Somewhere through the stone, A dull knock suggests another household setting something down. The village is not silent, only enclosed. Sounds arrive softened by walls, bends, and distance. Your own steps become part of that shared rhythm. A load comes home. A tool is put away. Someone waits at a narrow turn. The doorway ahead is low enough to show as a darker shape beneath the hearth glow. You warn the people inside and prepare to enter. One person near the doorway moves back, but only as far as the fixed stone fittings allow. The house is a single room, roughly 40 square meters in the surviving examples, with a central hearth and stone-built features around the walls. 40 square meters can sound generous until several adults, stored vessels, tools, coverings, and an active fire all require the same floor. You lower the vessel through the entrance. Its base touches down first. Your shoulder follows. The person inside takes the rim, and together you bring the load clear of the threshold without tipping it toward the hearth. Stone furniture has many virtues, but none of them include stepping politely aside. You set the vessel near a wall, not yet in its final place. The damp outer covering comes next. Its material and cut are not preserved clearly enough to name with confidence, so it remains simply a covering, useful and wet. You peel it back carefully and keep it away from the food and from the central flame. The room smells of smoke, warmed stone, dampness, and whatever food work has already been done. Those sensations are plausible, low-stakes staging rather than excavated measurements. What matters is the action they prompt. You place the wet layer where it can dry without blocking the root. The household has made room for you. Now you must return the favor by making room for everyone else. The hearth is the most certain center in the room. Stone settings for central fires survive in the houses. Even when roof form, ventilation, fuel and smoke escape remain uncertain. You crouch beside the embers and look before touching anything. The fire does not need enthusiasm. It needs judgment. A large addition might brighten the room, warm the nearest hands, and send more smoke into a space whose roof opening cannot be reconstructed with confidence. Too little attention would leave the glow fading, while damp clothing and evening work still compete for warmth. You choose a few dry pieces from the household supply without naming their material. Peat, wood, dung, seaweed, and other fuels have all entered discussions of prehistoric Orkney. But the exact mixture for this hearth on this night is not known. The safest description is the one your hands require. Some pieces are drier, some catch more cleanly, and you save the best of them for now. One piece goes near the brightest ember. You wait. A thin flame appears, then steadies. Smoke rises into the upper darkness, rather than spreading immediately across faces. The fire has accepted the adjustment, which is more cooperation than a hearth is obliged to offer. You sit back on your heels and turn to the vessel while the flame remains small. The waiting matters as much as the fuel. A hurried second piece would change the air before anyone had learned what the first one was doing. Your eyes need time after the passage. The central fire lights the nearest stone edges and leaves recesses beyond them uncertain. Whatever portable lights may have existed, no bright, even illumination survives for us to place around the room. Work after dark depends on memory as much as sight. You know where the tall slab arrangement stands opposite the entrance. Modern visitors call it a dresser because its shelves and upright stones look familiar. Historic Environment Scotland keeps the word in quotation marks and treats its function cautiously. It may have stored or displayed special objects. It may also have served purposes that the modern label does not capture. For this household, tonight, it is a useful fixed ledge. You move one small object away from its edge and make space for the item you carried in. That action does not prove a universal rule or a permanent use. It only shows how a surviving form could participate in an ordinary task. The dresser has kept its shape for 5,000 years and its job description to itself. Another adult reaches across at the same moment. Both hands stop. You withdraw yours, receive a tool in exchange, and wait until the ledge is clear. No one rearranges the furniture, because the furniture has made a long and successful career of being stone. The final vessel contains food or material intended for later use, but the scene does not need an exact recipe. Pottery, barley grains, animal bones, fish remains, and many tools survive from Skara Brae. They show a broad economy across centuries, not a dated menu for one composite winter evening. You lift the cover and test the upper layer with 2 fingers. The contents feel dry. No damp smell rises from the vessel. You cannot measure moisture, but you can compare it with the household's recent experience, and that is enough to decide where it should stand. A second pot rests farther from the hearth. You shift it a hand's breadth away from a cool wall seam and place a small stone beneath one edge. The movement is minor, its purpose is not. Stored resources only help with winter if they remain usable. The pot answers every inquiry with the grave silence expected of several kilograms of pottery. You close both vessels before ash can wander into them. One adult checks the cover, while another clears the path behind you. The room's fixed fittings make storage look orderly from above, yet the living arrangement depends on repeated adjustment. Dry things stay together, wet things move elsewhere, hot surfaces receive space. The household makes those distinctions again and again, and the winter system begins to appear through the repetition. Near your foot is a small stone-lined box sunk into the floor. Similar features are sometimes called tanks or limpet boxes. Some were made watertight with clay, and one suggestion links them to preparing fish bait. The label is convenient. The function is not certain. You step around it anyway. Archaeological caution does not require household clumsiness. A bone point lies near a working stone. You pick it up and examine the tip in the firelight. Skara Brae produced bone awls, pins, beads, and other worked objects, along with stone tools and pottery. The tool in your hand can be useful without being assigned to a particular gender, trade, or owner. A strip of material needs attention before it becomes a larger tier. You pass the point to another adult, who begins a small repair while you set a stone edge beside the hearth, close enough to find but far enough from bare feet. The tank has declined to explain itself for 5 millennia. The bone point has a clearer answer because someone is using it. That contrast is important. The surviving floor plan invites confident stories, but action should follow the strength of the evidence. A central hearth is certain. A worked bone point is certain. The exact rule for this floor box is not. You leave the box unlabeled in your mind and keep the walking path clear. The stone-sided areas along the walls are conventionally called box beds. Their slab boundaries survive, but the soft materials once placed inside do not, and the arrangement does not reveal who slept where. Older interpretations sometimes assigned sides by gender. The evidence cannot support that certainty. You smooth one covering and move a bundle from the edge. Another adult arrives with a different idea about where the bundle belongs. Both of you look at the same fixed slab, then at the same narrow space between it and the hearth. Stone furniture ends an argument mainly by refusing to participate. The bundle moves, the slab does not. No permanent household law follows from the decision. Tonight, the change opens enough room for a person to settle without placing a foot in the main route. You check the opposite stone enclosure as well. Its exact use might have shifted over the life of the house, just as buildings and passages changed across the settlement. The visible plan should not be treated as a frozen arrangement occupied by one unchanging family. For the moment, the practical question is smaller. Are the coverings as dry as they can be? Is the path open? Can someone lie down without disturbing the hearth or the stored pots? The answers are good enough. You turn back toward the center, where another crossing is already beginning. You lift one edge of a dry covering, feel the stone beneath, and lower it again. The check changes nothing because nothing needs changing, which is useful information before the room grows darker. The crossing near the hearth completes itself in stages. One adult carries the repaired strip toward a stone-sided recess. You reach for the same place with a folded covering, and both of you stop before elbows meet. Nothing in the surviving arrangement tells us which person normally used that space. A fixed slab may divide an area, support another stone, or mark a boundary whose social meaning changed from household to household and from year to year. The room is durable. Its rules are not preserved. You hold the covering against your chest, while the other adult places the repaired strip down. A tool comes back into your hand. You set it on the nearby ledge, then slide the covering into the space that remains. The exchange needs no grand settlement. Habit, a glance, and the order of tasks are enough. The stone cannot be pushed aside to improve the arrangement, so the people adjust instead. From the doorway, a cooler thread of air reaches the floor. Someone has left the entrance partly open after the last passage journey. You nod toward it. The nearest person draws the barrier closer, though its exact form is another lost detail. The room settles by one small degree. You return the tool to its place and check that the route from the hearth to the entrance is still clear. A pottery vessel stands behind the first load, broad enough that its contents matter, and heavy enough that nobody wants to move it twice. You crouch, lift the cover, and press 2 fingers into the top layer. Barley grains were recovered at Skara Brae. Pottery fragments and complete forms show that containers were part of daily work. Those facts do not preserve the exact method used to keep grain through winter, nor do they tell us whether this particular vessel held barley, another dry resource, or something prepared in a different way. For the composite household, you treat it as grain because the evidence makes that plausible, and the action remains modest. The upper layer is loose, not clumped. You turn a few grains into your palm, look for dampness in the low light, and let them fall back. The vessel passes. You replace the cover before a spark or drifting ash can make an unnecessary contribution. A flat stone goes across the top to discourage accidental hands and curious feet. There is no triumphant storehouse moment. Winter security looks like this instead. A person kneeling by a pot, noticing that nothing has gone wrong, and taking care that it stays that way. You rise slowly, one hand on the wall, and move to the next container. The inspection also protects the household from needless disturbance. Every opening admits hands, air, grit, and the possibility that a secure cover will not return securely. The next portion is not grain. It has been kept apart from the damp covering and away from the busiest route. You check its wrapping, tighten one fastening, and place it where a careless heel will not undo the work. Animal remains from the settlement include cattle, sheep or goat, pig, fish, birds, and smaller quantities of deer, shellfish, and other coastal resources also appear in the wider evidence. These remains accumulate across long occupation, and they cannot be folded into a single evening meal as though excavation had supplied a menu. So you do not name the portion too precisely. It is food prepared or preserved for later use, and its value lies in remaining usable. The wrapping must stay secure. The place beside it must remain dry. The household will decide when to open it, not the narrator. An adult near the hearth shifts a pot to make room. You move the portion farther from the damp clothing, then test the floor beneath it with your knuckles. The stone is cool but not visibly wet. That is enough for tonight. You leave the bundle where air and people can reach it without placing it in the path. Behind you, the fire makes a small settling sound. You turn before the change can become a problem. A loose coal has rolled near the small stone-lined feature in the floor. You catch it with a flat tool and guide it back toward the hearth before it reaches a covering. The floor feature is often called a tank, a trough, or a limpet box. Some examples were carefully sealed with clay. One interpretation suggests that such containers may have held limpets while they were prepared as fish bait. That is possible. It is not a household instruction written in stone. A modern label is useful until the object declines to confirm it. You kneel beside the feature and feel along its rim, not to discover its ancient purpose for us, but to make sure nothing has fallen inside. The cavity is clear. You set a small stone beside the edge, so that a moving foot will notice the boundary in dim light. The act is plausible because any sunken feature in a busy room requires attention. It does not assign the box a permanent function. Another household might have used a similar form differently, and the same house might have changed its practice over generations. The coal is safely back among the embers. The floor path is marked. You wipe the tool on a dry scrap and place it within reach. One uncertain feature has been handled without becoming an invented certainty, and the evening continues. 3 working objects lie together near the wall: a bone point, a chipped or ground stone edge, and a heavier stone used against other materials. You gather them before someone settles a covering over the whole group. Skara Brae has yielded large numbers of bone and stone tools, pottery, ornaments, and carved objects. Their abundance shows repeated making, mending, cutting, grinding, piercing, and handling. It does not make every house a specialized workshop, or every tool the property of one named kind of person. You inspect the bone point first. Its tip is sound after the small repair. The stone edge carries a smear that should be cleaned before it dries. The heavier stone needs only to be returned to the place where a hand will expect it. Each object goes down with its useful side turned away from the walking route. The arrangement is simple enough to remember in poor light: sharp point inward, heavy stone low, working edge covered. The tools make the room feel less like a surviving plan and more like a sequence of unfinished tasks. A strap will need another hole. A vessel surface may need smoothing. Grain will need crushing. Nothing announces itself as important, yet winter life depends on many such quiet capacities. You finish the row, count the objects once, and turn toward the resting spaces. A chipped edge is turned toward the wall, while the smoother grip stays outward. The arrangement protects hands moving in low light and keeps the working faces from knocking against one another. The coverings in the stone-sided recess nearest you have been disturbed by the evening's movement. You lift one edge, shake out a fold, and spread it again within the slab boundary. Archaeologists conventionally call these enclosures box beds because they resemble bed spaces. The stone frames survive. The softer filling does not. Nor does any record identify the sleepers, assign one side to women or men, or prove that every enclosure held the same purpose throughout the house's life. You use the area for rest because it is a cautious, practical reconstruction, not because the floor plan has delivered a household census. The covering beneath your hands is left undescribed beyond what the action needs. It is warm enough to value, dry enough to use, and worn enough to require careful handling. A small bundle has slipped into the foot space. You move it to a ledge and press the covering flat. Another adult checks the opposite edge. Together you remove a grit of stone that would make itself increasingly persuasive after an hour beneath a shoulder. No one chooses a place by title or rank in this telling. The household simply prepares the available spaces. When the surface is ready, you leave it empty for the person who will use it and return to the shared center. The empty resting place lasts less than a minute. One adult brings a bundle toward it, just as another begins to lower a folded covering there. The same fixed slab receives 2 plans and offers no assistance. The surviving room cannot tell us who usually won such disagreements, whether places were permanent, or how use changed when households grew, shrank, or rebuilt. It shows only that people worked around substantial stone fittings that could not be rearranged on a cold evening. You take the lighter bundle from one pair of hands and move it to the ledge cleared earlier. The folded covering remains in the recess. A second, smaller bundle fits beneath the ledge without blocking the route. The fixed slab settles the disagreement by remaining exactly where it is. The dry line earns a brief breath of amusement, then the problem is finished. No voice rises. The person who surrendered the ledge receives the repaired tool instead, and turns to another task. This is cooperation without ceremony. It does not mean perfect harmony, and the absence of obvious weapons at the site would never prove a community without conflict. It means only that tonight's small competition for space has a workable answer. You check the path once more. The hearth, the doorway, and both resting areas can be reached without climbing over anyone's possessions. That path is narrow enough to deserve its own attention. A single-room house of about 40 square meters may look orderly in a plan, especially when the stone fittings are drawn cleanly. The living floor is less obedient. A pot projects from one side. A damp covering hangs near another. Someone is kneeling at the hearth. A tool has been placed where it is visible, but not yet safe. You move through these claims one by one. The pot goes closer to the wall. The damp covering is folded back. The tool returns to the inward-facing row. You ask the person by the fire to shift one knee, and the way opens between the entrance and the resting spaces. There is no separate corridor inside the house. Movement depends on a route maintained by everybody who uses it. The result is not spaciousness, but choreography, learnt by repetition and occasionally corrected by a bruise. You make the crossing twice, once empty-handed and once with a small vessel. On the second journey, nothing catches your clothing, no foot meets the floor box, no elbow sends a pot toward the hearth. The successful passage is almost invisible, which is how useful household systems often look. They remove a problem before it becomes a story. You set down the vessel and listen as another footstep approaches through the covered link outside. The footstep slows before the doorway. A neighbor gives a brief call, and someone inside answers. The low entrance admits a hand first, then a small wrapped object passed from one household to another. Covered passages linked the houses, allowing movement through much of the settlement without a full crossing of open ground. The connection does not prove that every resource was shared or that all households behaved as one family. It does show repeated physical closeness and routes through which help, news, tools, food and inconvenience could travel. You receive the bundle and place it near the dresser ledge. In return, another adult sends out the bone point used for the earlier repair. The exchange is quick. The neighbor has no wish to crawl farther into a room already conducting several tasks around one fire. A few words pass, none recoverable. You do not invent them. The objects and movement are enough. The hand withdraws. The sound of knees and feet moves back around the passage bend. You close the entrance as far as the household arrangement permits and return to the hearth before the new fuel changes character. Outside the room, the linked route remains available. Inside, one borrowed object has arrived, and one useful tool has gone where it is needed next. The fire has eaten through the smallest piece and begun to lean toward one side. You select another dry fragment from the supply, break it only as much as necessary, and place it where the ember can reach. The hearth is secure evidence. The exact fuel for this moment is not. Later writers have proposed peat, wood, dung, seaweed, and other possibilities for Neolithic Orkney, but the site does not permit a confident list for every fire. You therefore work with pieces described only by what your hands can judge: dry, slower, quicker, smoky, or clean. The new piece catches along one edge. You wait, rather than add another. A fire in the middle of a single room must serve cooking, warmth, light, and work without making the space unbearable. That balance is a skill learnt through consequence. A person across from you lowers a face covering as the first thread of smoke rises. You nudge the piece inward. The flame becomes smaller and steadier. No clever device has solved the room's winter. The useful result comes from attention, stored fuel of some kind, a central stone setting, and the willingness to keep checking. You hold your hands near the warmth for a moment, then look upward into the uncertain darkness above the fire. You wait through several breaths before deciding against another piece. The smaller flame is sufficient for the next task, and restraint keeps both the fuel supply and the air easier to manage. You keep your eyes on the upper part of the room. Smoke thins as it rises, then gathers briefly where the firelight can no longer define the roof. The roofs of the houses do not survive. Archaeologists have suggested timber, driftwood, whalebone, turf, hides, and combinations of materials, but no complete roof gives us its pitch, opening, or normal path for smoke. The passages are better understood, with roofing slabs and traces suggesting clay and turf above them. The house overhead remains a reconstruction. Your response is therefore kept plausible and limited. You draw the entrance partly open and wait. Cooler air moves low across the floor. Smoke shifts upward and away from the nearest faces. You nudge the newest fuel inward and remove a fragment that is smouldering more than burning. No one announces a theory of ventilation. People change the conditions they can observe. Eyes sting less, breathing becomes easier. The room loses a little warmth, but the hearth steadies. After a short interval, the entrance closes again. The exact barrier is left uncertain, while the consequence is clear enough for the story. The household has traded a brief draft for cleaner air. You watch another moment. The smoke remains higher. Only then do you turn back to the final vessel and the smaller containers waiting beside it. The adjustment is temporary and observed. It does not become a fixed ventilation rule for every house, fire, wind direction, or stage of occupation. The load that began outside is ready to be divided. You bring two smaller pots close, check that their interiors are clean, and lift the cover from the larger vessel. Pottery was abundant at Skara Brae, including the decorated tradition archaeologists call grooved ware. A vessel could hold, carry, mix, or serve many things, but fragments rarely preserve the full routine around one winter evening. The narration does not supply a recipe that excavation did not. You use a small scoop and transfer part of the contents. One portion is intended for nearer use. Another must remain untouched. The distinction matters more than the exact food. A child or younger household member reaches toward the open pot, then receives a quiet hand at the wrist and a different task. The cover needs holding. That work is accepted with the solemnity appropriate to being trusted near supper. You level the first portion, seal it, and move it away from the hearth. The second pot receives less and goes closer to the working area. The large vessel is closed last. Dry things remain dry. Hot things stay beyond careless hands. Tomorrow's share survives tonight's appetite. The younger helper releases the cover. You thank them with a nod, set the scoop beside the working stones, and clear the floor again. A small object has vanished from the working place. You find it half hidden in a fold of covering. Lift it, and look toward the tall slab feature opposite the entrance. The word dresser makes the arrangement instantly familiar to modern eyes. Uprights and shelves invite comparison with furniture designed for storage or display. Historic Environment Scotland suggests that special objects may have been kept or shown there, but the possibility is not a recovered rule. Tonight you use one ledge because it is visible and safely above the floor. The object goes near the back, beyond an accidental sleeve. You place a second small item beside it, leaving enough space for a hand to retrieve either one. The ledge is admirably permanent and entirely unwilling to explain the arrangement. Another adult notices what you have done and moves one piece slightly farther from the edge. That correction could mean shared practice, individual preference, or simple fear of dropping something onto stone. No deeper claim is required. For a moment the fire catches both objects and the slab behind them. The scene resembles display, but resemblance is not proof. You remember only the useful decision. Small things that matter should not disappear into bedding. With the ledge in order, you turn to the delicate strand lying in a shallow container below. Inside the shallow container are several flat bone beads. You lift the short strand by supporting it across both palms, careful not to pull against the fastening. A necklace from Skara Brae, now in the British Museum, consists of 72 flat bone beads restrung in modern times. The surviving beads prove skilled shaping and the value of ornament. The modern string does not preserve the ancient arrangement, and the museum record cannot identify the original wearer or the place where the beads were kept. The strand in your hands is imaginative staging based on that real class of object. It remains short, plausible, and quiet. You do not decide whether it belongs to you, to another adult, or to the household as a whole. One bead has turned across its neighbor. You ease it flat. The small movement catches the firelight, and then disappears when you lower your hands. You set the strand near the back of the ledge, away from grinding dust and damp coverings. An adult beside you checks the position and adds a folded scrap beneath it. That care tells us less than a name would, but it is enough. An object that required work to make would also require care to keep. You cover the container and move back toward the heavier working stones. A small grinding task remains before everyone can stop. You settle a rounded stone against a larger surface and draw it across a handful of material in short, controlled strokes. Querns, pestles, hammerstones, polishers, and many other stone tools have been recorded from Skara Brae. Their forms preserve labor better than any single finished meal. They show that substances were crushed, ground, shaped, or smoothed by repeated pressure. The material under your hand is left general. It may be grain or another substance suited to the tool. What matters is the effort. The stone resists at first. Your wrist changes angle. The second pass is easier. Someone near the hearth waits for the working surface, so you complete only what is needed. A few more strokes reduce the coarse pieces. You brush the result into a small vessel and wipe the larger stone with a dry scrap. This is not dramatic work, yet it explains part of winter endurance. Supplies must be transformed before they can be used. Tools must be where hands expect them. The person doing the task must stop before tired movement sends material across the floor. You place the rounded stone beside its partner. The waiting adult takes your place, and you rise to collect the bundles still outside the room. A few coarse fragments remain on the stone. You gather them into the vessel rather than grinding past the needed point, preserving both the portion and the tool's worn surface. The bundle rests just beyond the low doorway, protected by the covered passage, but still inconveniently out of reach. You kneel, turn, and begin backing through the entrance. Low thresholds and tight turns reward a plan. You announce yourself before moving, because the doorway permits only one plan at a time. A person inside shifts a pot. Another draws both feet clear. The hearth remains behind you, warm enough to feel but too far away to see while you reach. Your hand finds the bundle. It is lighter than the first vessel and much less cooperative in shape. One loose end catches on the wall facing. You stop, release it, and pull the load lengthwise. The passage has no posted rules, yet everyone knows the penalty for improvising. You bring the bundle across the threshold without striking the lintel. Once inside, you turn it away from the central fire and loosen the fastening. The contents are dry coverings or useful material, kept deliberately vague where preservation is weak. Two adults receive the load. One carries a portion toward the resting area. The other folds the remainder beside the wall. You rub the shoulder that met the doorway on the way out, decide it has survived, and close the entrance enough to reduce the returning draft. Before you can stand, the neighbor from the passage calls again. A vessel cover has loosened, and two hands are needed while the fastening is drawn tight. You lean through the entrance. The neighbor holds the pot steady against the floor. You press the cover down, while another person winds and secures the tie. The material of that tie is not named. Cordage and basketry are plausible in Neolithic life, but perishable details survive unevenly, and the action does not need false precision. The village layout makes this kind of assistance easy to imagine. Houses connect at close range, and bodies meet in passages built on a human scale. The exact obligations of neighbors are unknown, so the story asks only for a minute of practical help. The fastening tightens. You test the cover with one finger. It holds. Both households gain something small. The neighbor has a safer store. You know the route outside your own door is clear. The exchange creates no ideal community and no permanent rule. It is simply sensible cooperation where one person lacks enough hands. You withdraw into the room. The neighbor moves away with the secured vessel, knees and shoulders disappearing around the bend. The hearth has not changed during your absence. You close the entrance and check its edges before returning to the center. The entrance closure meets stone along one side and leaves a thin gap along the other. You press it into a better position, then feel the air at floor level with the back of your hand. The low entrances are clear in the architecture. The perishable barriers that close them are not. Hinges, coverings, frames and fastenings cannot be reconstructed as a single certain design for every house and period. You therefore handle a simple mixed closure without describing its construction beyond what the moment requires. The draft weakens. A faint movement of air remains, useful after the smoke adjustment. You leave the barrier there rather than forcing a complete seal. Behind you, the flame holds close to the fuel. The person nearest the hearth no longer lowers a face covering. Another adult crosses the floor without stepping around a loose edge at the entrance. A winter house is not made comfortable once. It is corrected repeatedly. The opening changes with movement. The fire changes with fuel. Wet materials change as they dry. Each adjustment affects the next. You test the closure one more time and make sure it can still be moved quickly. The linked passage should remain available, not become a trap created in the name of warmth. Satisfied, you turn toward a small spill glistening near the foot of a stone fitting. Water from the damp covering has gathered in a shallow line across the floor. You take a scrap of absorbent material, draw the moisture away from the main path, and watch it follow a slight slope. Drains run beneath parts of the settlement, especially the later visible houses. They are carefully built, but their complete courses and exact purposes are not always known. Suggestions include carrying water or waste, and some channels may relate to the floor features often called tanks. Certainty fades once the surviving section disappears beneath stone. You do not need the complete plan to respond to the spill. The floor directs the water toward a lower point. You wipe once more, then place the damp scrap with the other wet materials. The action avoids a modern claim about sanitation. It also avoids pretending that water simply vanished from crowded interiors. Builders noticed slopes, channels, and the movement of moisture. Residents would have noticed them too. Your heel tests the cleaned route. The stone is no longer slick. A person carrying a pot crosses safely a moment later. The drain below remains partly mysterious, but the immediate judgment is settled. Water has moved away from bedding, food, and feet. You rinse nothing, name no plumbing system, and return the scrap to dry where it will not touch the household stores. You stand near the entrance and look across the room, not as a diagram, but as a chain of completed tasks. The outer load came through the covered passage. Thick stone construction and packed material reduced exposure around the house. The central hearth received careful fuel and a brief change of air. Pots were checked. Wet coverings moved away from stores. Tools returned to useful places. Resting areas were prepared. Neighbors passed an object and secured a vessel. None of these acts is large enough to become a heroic answer. Together they answer the practical question much better than a single clever feature could. The architecture matters. Flat slabs, double walling, packing, low entrances, and linked routes create the setting in which work can continue. Stored resources matter. Clothing and coverings matter. Fire matters. Tools matter. Yet every part requires people who remember, inspect, share space, and correct small failures. You take one slow circuit with your eyes. The entrance is clear. The hearth is steady. The pots are covered. The damp layer is separate. No one has to cross the room for an unfinished task. Winter survival begins to look less like victory over weather and more like a domestic system repeated until it becomes ordinary. You lower your hands and listen to the quieter room. Each success also depends on earlier labor beyond the room. Raising animals, tending barley, finding other resources, shaping containers, and maintaining the stone around them. The room's fixed fittings matter because practiced people work around them together. Their value appears through repeated movement, not through a single feature acting as a winter machine. One final pot remains open beside the working surface. You fit its cover, settle a flat stone above it, and move the bone point beyond the edge of the nearest covering. The durable remains at Skara Brae preserve a framework. Walls, hearths, drains, fitted slabs, pottery, tools, ornaments, animal bones, and plant traces. The routine joining those things has to be reconstructed with restraint. A stone does not record who touched it last. A pot does not preserve every decision made around it. Your task is to leave no obvious decision waiting. The grinding stone is clean. The smaller vessel sits where it can be reached in the morning. The repaired strip lies with the item it serves. Wet material remains apart. Around the hearth, crossings decrease. One adult settles near a stone-sided recess. Another turns a pot once and lets it stand. The younger helper places the scoop where you showed them earlier. The household is not declaring the night conquered. Cold remains outside and partly within. The fire will need later attention. People may wake. A cover may loosen. The point is not perfect security. The point is that the last round has reduced uncertainty. Each necessary object has a place for the next few hours. You brush grit from your palms and begin the circuit that will answer the title promise. From the doorway you move to the hearth. From the hearth to the food vessels. From the vessels to the resting spaces, and back toward the entrance. The route is short. Its meaning is cumulative. Skara Brae survived long northern winters, not because one feature defeated the season, but because many ordinary provisions worked together. Stone walls and packed deposits created substantial shelter. Covered passages protected movement between houses. Central fires were tended with judgment. Food had been produced, gathered, processed, and stored. Clothing and coverings were kept as dry as possible. Tools remained ready. People coordinated their movements and lent one another hands. Every part had limits. Stone rooms could still be damp. Fires could smoke. Stores could spoil. Narrow routes could obstruct. Fixed fittings could complicate crowded life. The system worked through attention and repetition, not magic. You touch the covered pot, glance at the small flame, and confirm that the entrance can move. Another adult checks the opposite side without being asked. That is the title answer. Survival is a household practice made from shelter, resources, firework, tools, clothing, linked movement, and social cooperation. No lone resident stands against a theatrical storm. Several people complete modest tasks before rest. You return to the hearth with nothing left in your hands. The household begins to settle. You lower yourself beside the others, close enough to the hearth for warmth, and far enough that a shifting covering cannot reach the flame. Across the centuries of occupation, houses at Skara Brae were altered, rebuilt, and sometimes replaced. The visible settlement combines phases. It cannot be treated as one frozen arrangement occupied by the same households at a single moment. This evening has therefore followed a carefully composite adult through actions supported by the architecture and finds. It has not recovered a personal name, exact speech, gendered side of the room, or fixed use for every stone feature. The modesty does not weaken the human picture. It keeps the picture honest. The load is home. The stores have been checked. The wet covering is separated. The tools are clear of bedding. The path remains open. The hearth has settled to a smaller glow. One person adjusts a folded layer. Another places a hand near the warmth and then withdraws it. The younger helper lies down without crossing the working route again. You listen until the room's separate movements become slower and easier to distinguish. A pot settles against its stone support. Fuel shifts inward. Breathing lengthens. The ordinary goal is complete, and no new task asks to be invented. A final set of footsteps passes outside. The sound enters through the low doorway, moves along the wall, and fades around the next bend without anyone coming in. The covered passage remains what it has been throughout the evening, a connection between households. It is not an emergency route from one catastrophic storm, and the winter night does not need a rescue. Somewhere beyond the stone, another person is completing another small round. Inside, the central hearth holds its quiet line of light. The tall slab feature opposite the entrance keeps its objects. Covered pots rest near the wall. The stone-sided resting areas contain people rather than archaeological labels. You do not know how late it is. No clock divides the darkness. The household judges time through completed work, fire, tired bodies, and the long interval before daylight. Your last movement is to draw one loose edge of covering away from the walking path. Then your hand comes to rest. The village continues through the linked passages, not as a perfect community, and not as a single preserved moment, but as repeated human practice. Stone, packed earth, stored resources, tools, fire and neighbours have done their work together. The title story closes with the passage still connected and the household settled beside the central hearth. The village returns in another part of its long life. You follow a different adult along a passage wall, one hand carrying a small working stone and the other searching the joint ahead. Rain has already touched the outer ground. More wet weather is likely, though no exact forecast or season calendar survives. The practical evidence is beneath your thumb. A facing slab near the passage gives slightly when pressed. Fine packing shifts behind it, and a damp line darkens the edge. Skara Brae was built, altered, repaired, and rebuilt over many generations. Maintenance is not a disturbance to a perfect original plan. It is part of how the settlement existed. Walls that survive for us may contain responses to earlier faults, later needs, and changing arrangements. You press again, more gently. The movement is small, but the next loaded shoulder through this turn will not make it smaller. A loose edge can admit more water, shed grit into the root, or shift under weight. Another adult kneels on the inner side and feels the same joint. The two of you agree without needing a recovered sentence. This should be corrected before the next wet night. You set down the working stone, clear loose material from the base, and look toward the flat slabs kept nearby for repair. Two possible slabs lie against the wall. Both are local sandstone, split into the flat forms that made stone building practical in Orkney. Natural bedding planes provide useful pieces, but nature does not label them for a particular joint. You lift the thinner slab first and set one edge against the opening. It reaches the height but rocks when pressure moves from left to right. A small projection prevents full contact. You could chip it, yet the stone may remain too slight for the place. The second slab is thicker. You tilt it upright, test its lower edge, and feel the weight settle through your arms. The slab that fits best is, with perfect consistency, the one least interested in being carried. A neighbour takes the far end. Together you move it closer without dragging the working face across grit. At the joint, you stand it beside the wall and compare the angles. Its edge follows the gap more closely. One corner will need bedding. The opposite face can overlap the neighbouring stone without narrowing the passage too far. The choice is not scientific optimization in modern terms. It is skilled comparison, using weight, shape, contact, and experience. You reject the lighter slab, mark it for another repair, and prepare to lift the heavier one into position. You run one palm along the chosen edge and find no loose scale that would fall into the passage. The slab is heavy, but its contact points are broad enough to justify the effort. The loose-facing stone comes away only after the material behind it has been supported. You hold the new slab against the outer line, while the adult inside steadies the inner face. Many walls at Skara Brae were built with two stone skins rather than one solid stack. Flat slabs formed faces on either side, and the cavity between them received varied packing. The exact proportions and materials differed by place and phase. That construction gives the repair its order. If you pull too much packing first, the facing loses support. If you force the new slab before clearing the edge, it may bear on one point and rock again. You remove a handful of loose grit. The inner adult presses a smaller stone into a gap. Together you raise the replacement and let its lower edge meet the prepared bed. For a moment the weight rests entirely in your hands, then the bottom takes part of it. You ease the upper face toward the wall until it meets the adjacent slab. The double construction is not an abstract cross-section now. It is two people feeling movement through separate faces of the same joint. The stone stands, but it is not yet secure. You keep one shoulder against it, while the neighbor reaches for packing material. The neighbor presses from the opposite side, while you feel for a change at the upper corner. The slab shifts less than a finger's breadth, enough to show where packing must carry the remaining gap. The packing is not a single substance scooped from one uniform heap. You gather clay-rich material, sand, ash, small stone fragments, and selected occupation debris already present around the work. Older archaeological language often called the deposits surrounding the house's midden. That word can suggest one great accumulation of household rubbish. Detailed study shows more varied formation. Some material came from occupation, some from building, some from leveling or deliberate placement, and some from later change. Your repair uses what is suitable at this joint. Coarser pieces go low, where they can fill larger spaces. Finer material follows, worked inward with a flat tool. Clay helps bind and close the surface, while small stones prevent the new slab from leaning into the cavity. You do not mix a measured recipe. The proportions answer the gap beneath your fingers. The adult on the inner face calls when material begins to press through. You stop, change angle, and pack from above instead. Each push reduces the faint movement of the slab. When the cavity is nearly full, you tamp the surface lightly rather than crushing it. The joint feels firmer. You set aside the remaining material, knowing another layer will be needed after the outer face is checked. A narrow seam remains between the replacement slab and the older facing stone. You take clay-rich material in both hands, press it into the opening, and smooth the surface with the side of a flat tool. Evidence from the settlement suggests that clay, probably obtained locally, was used to clad outer walls and fill vulnerable places. Much of that coating has not survived as a complete skin, so the exact appearance of a finished house remains uncertain. The task before you is easier to justify. Clay closes the visible seam. You work it beneath a slight overhang and feather the edge across both stones. A small crack opens when the thicker section dries at the surface, so you press again with a wetter thumb. The finish needs patience more than elegance. Water finds vanity and cracks with equal enthusiasm. You remove the excess from the passage edge. A smooth bulge would catch clothing, and a beautiful repair that obstructs movement would not remain beautiful for long. The adult inside pushes once against the wall. You feel no immediate shift. The clay surface trembles but does not split. You leave it slightly rough, with enough texture to receive another thin layer later. The seam is closed for now, and the next task lies at the crowded boundary beneath your knees. The tool leaves shallow marks across the wet surface. They are not decoration, only the visible result of pressure used to close an awkward edge. At the base of the wall, dark and pale materials meet without the tidy border a drawing might give them. Ash lies beside clay. Small animal bone fragments occur near stone chips. Sand runs through an older deposit and disappears beneath later packing. You kneel carefully, choosing only loose material that can be moved without opening a deeper layer. The adult who once made this repair would not have known the archaeological sequence under modern names. They would have known that one patch was firm, another crumbled, and water followed the easiest space. The distinction matters for our reconstruction. Deposits around Skara Brae formed through many activities and at different times. Calling all of it midden would hide that variety. Calling every fragment refuse would ignore deliberate building use. You lift a loose stone chip from the joint and leave the compact layer beneath it untouched. A handful of gritty fill is replaced with better packing. The removed fragment goes with repair debris, not into the walking route. The damp line now stops at the clay facing rather than entering behind the slab. You mark the edge with a finger and watch for change. The work proceeds through practical recognition, not a perfect classification. Useful material stays, loose material moves. The wall remains supported while the history beneath it keeps its complicated layers. You leave the darker deposit where it still supports the outer face and remove only what crumbles beneath pressure. That choice keeps the repair narrow and avoids turning a small defect into needless rebuilding. The repair sits beside a low entrance, and repeated movement has polished one threshold stone while loosening a smaller piece at the edge. You run 2 fingers along the contact point. Entrances survive clearly in the houses, often low and narrow. Doors or barriers made partly from perishable material are less certain. We can see where bodies passed and where stone framed the opening, but not every fastening that controlled air and access. The small packing stone turns under your thumb. Left alone, it could work free into the passage and leave the facing above it less stable. You lift it, clean the bed, and try the same piece at a new angle. It sits lower and no longer projects into the root. The second flake fills the space behind it. Clay closes the outer edge. Another adult tests the threshold by entering with an empty basket. 1 foot clears. A knee passes without striking the new stone. The basket does not scrape the wall. That movement matters as much as the firmness of the joint. An entrance must support the wall and remain usable by people carrying things through it. You press the packing stone once more. It holds. The basket carrier turns inside, returns through the opening, and leaves you to inspect the passage roof above. The covered root narrows where 2 roofing slabs overlap. You tilt your head and follow the joint from below. A line of grit has fallen along one side, suggesting that an edge has shifted or the material above has opened. Later passages at Skara Brae were roofed with stone slabs, with evidence for clay and turf laid over them. That construction offered shelter around the links between houses. It also required attention where slabs met and water found seams. The passage roof offers excellent protection provided nobody asks it for generous standing height. You remain at the side rather than lifting the heavy roof stone from beneath. Another adult reaches the upper edge from outside the passage, clears loose material, and pushes packing toward the overlap. You guide from below, calling when grit stops falling. A thin clay line is worked into the exposed seam. Turf above is left described only in broad terms, since its original arrangement cannot be inspected in this moment. You pass an empty vessel through the root. Its rim clears the corrected edge. No fresh particles fall. The repair says nothing about the roof of the house nearby. It concerns a better preserved kind of structure, the narrow covered passage whose stone slabs still show how movement was sheltered. You brush grit from your hair and continue toward the darker wall beyond the junction. Above the house wall, the line of the lost roof invites completion. Your eye can imagine supports, coverings, and an opening for smoke. You stop before the imagination becomes evidence. No complete house roof survives at Skara Brae. Proposals have used several organic supports and coverings, sometimes in combination. Questions remain about span, support, pitch, ventilation, and smoke escape. Different buildings or phases may not have used one identical solution. The repair stays where the evidence is firmer. You inspect the top of the stone wall below the vanished roof line. One capstone has shifted enough to expose packing. You reset a small wedge beneath it and close the surface with clay. There is no need to supply an imaginary timber frame overhead or to send smoke through an invented hole. The adult's hands work on stone that survives in the archaeological record. A neighbor brings another flat fragment. You reject it because its edge would direct water inward. The existing wedge, turned slightly, gives a better fall. The capstone sits. You test it with the heel of your hand and feel no movement. Above it, uncertainty remains. Below it, the joint has improved. You collect the spare fragment and move toward the floor. where a shallow wet line offers a different kind of evidence. A small amount of water is poured near the troublesome floor edge. The test is careful, not a flood. You watch the narrow line choose its direction between stones. Drains run beneath several buildings and passages in the later settlement. Some pass under side cells or connect with floor features, but no entire system has been traced well enough to assign every channel one purpose. Interpretations involving water, waste, or latrine use remain debated. The water moves toward a low opening, hesitates, and spreads sideways. A shallow obstruction lies near the accessible mouth. You mark the level with a small pebble and pour no more. The test has answered tonight's question without pretending to map the buried course. Water should leave this edge more readily than it does. Using a thin bone or stone implement, you probe only the first hand's breadth of channel. Grit presses against the tip. Something larger rests behind it. The adult beside you holds a shallow container to receive whatever comes free. Neither of you opens the floor or disturbs the deeper structure. The drain's design remains uncertain. The immediate defect is clear. You shift your knees away from the wet line, set the probe at a lower angle, and begin to loosen the blockage piece by piece. The first grains of loosened material wash into the waiting container. You pause after each movement, watching whether the flow improves, before sending the probe deeper into a route whose full course you cannot see. The first material to emerge is fine grit. You draw it forward with the probe and collect it in the waiting container. A small stone fragment follows, turned sideways across the accessible channel. You grip the fragment between two fingers and work it free without widening the opening. Water trapped behind it appears as a thin run and passes under the floor. That result is enough. The deeper drain remains unseen, and you do not call it a sewer or assign it a complete sanitary function. Archaeologists have good reason to be cautious. The channels are complex. Later rebuilding altered relationships, and only parts can be followed. For the person kneeling here, the standard is practical. Water that pooled beside the wall now moves away. The threshold remains dry enough for feet and loads. No stone above has been disturbed. You wipe the channel mouth and replace one side packing piece. The loose grit goes outside the walking route. The fragment that caused the blockage is set aside for use as packing elsewhere, if its shape proves suitable. Another small pour follows. This time the line reaches the opening and disappears without spreading. You stop the test. More water would add nothing except another damp task. The probe is cleaned, the container lifted, and the repaired floor edge left to settle while you turn back to the wall. Beside the repaired face, an older line of masonry disappears beneath a later edge. The stones do not meet as they would in a wall raised all at once. One course turns inward. Another continues past it and then stops. Skara Brae changed through time. Early buildings may have stood more freely within the settlement deposits. Later construction brought houses and communicating passages into closer relationships. Walls were inserted, entrances altered, and structures built over or beside earlier remains. The joint under your hand is therefore not a mistake in one master plan. It is a record of adaptation. You clear only enough loose material to see where the active wall takes its weight. The buried line remains in place. Removing it might weaken the later face or open a void that has long been packed around. A smaller stone fits above the meeting point. You test it, turn it once, and bed it against the newer course without forcing pressure onto the older one. The adult beside you presses from the opposite side. Nothing shifts. For the household of this building phase, the choice is practical. Use the existing mass. Strengthen the part that carries the present wall. Leave the older stone where it contributes. You cover the meeting point with a thin protective layer and move along the face, where another buried slab appears beneath the passage edge. The buried slab is broad enough to tempt removal. Its upper edge projects into the packing, and lifting it might create space for a cleaner repair. You slide the tool beneath one corner, feel resistance, and stop. Chronology at Skara Brae is not a simple march from one complete village plan to another. Evidence points to early occupation, later rebuilding, changes in house form, overlapping structures, and perhaps intervals when parts of the site were used differently. Radiocarbon models give ranges, not a dated diary for every wall. The slab may belong to an earlier arrangement now incorporated into the later fabric. Taking it out could unsettle more than the visible edge. You withdraw the tool. A narrow packing stone fits above the projection instead. Clay and grit fill the remaining space, without loading the old slab unevenly. This decision does not preserve archaeology in a modern curatorial sense. The adult has no concept of future excavation. It is simply sensible building. A stone that has remained firm beneath the wall need not be moved merely because its first purpose has changed. You test the surface with both palms. The newer face holds against the older mass. The repair accepts the village as accumulated work, not a blank site waiting for one final design. A thin seam between faces remains visible after packing. You do not erase it merely to make the work look uniform. The seam records where today's practical decision meets material already accepted by earlier builders. You carry another basket of packing past a doorway, whose threshold belongs to a different episode of building from the wall beside it. The mismatch is visible only when you know to look. Daily movement has made the route feel singular. Archaeologists have identified parts of at least 28 structures at Skara Brae. Only portions of about 10 buildings and 4 passages are visible in the excavated settlement today. Some structures overlap, some survive only in fragments. The plan familiar to visitors is the selected surface of a much longer sequence. Your basket belongs to the house in use now, not to that modern aerial image. You turn through the active doorway, avoid the buried line at your foot, and deliver packing to the current repair. An adult takes the basket and returns an empty one. Neither person pauses to consider every wall beneath them. They work with the route that leads home and the stones that presently require attention. The distinction keeps the story honest. A settlement occupied for centuries cannot be narrated as though all visible rooms held their final furniture at one simultaneous supper. You step back through the doorway, feeling the polished threshold under your sole. The active passage bends left. An earlier line continues under the wall. You follow the bend that living people use. The replacement slab is ready for its final fitting. You and the neighbor lift it from the temporary support and lower the bottom edge onto the prepared bed. It rocks. You raise it again, clear a grain of stone from one contact point, and turn the slab slightly. The second position leans too far into the passage. The stone has not changed its mind, but you have finally begun to learn what its mind was. On the third attempt, the broader edge sits inward and the flatter face follows the root. A small wedge supports the lower corner. The upper end overlaps the adjacent slab without pressing it outward. Dry stone building depends on careful contact, weight, selection and balance. Mortar does not bind every joint into obedience. Each piece must meet the stones around it well enough to carry pressure and remain stable. You release one hand, then the other. The slab stands. The neighbor pushes from inside. You watch the upper edge and see no movement. A thin gap remains behind the face, ready for packing. The passage has lost almost no width. A loaded shoulder should clear. You place your palm against the stone and feel the weight pass downward rather than rocking across the joint. The fit is not beautiful from every angle. It is sound, which is the judgment the wet night requires. You work from the passage side while the neighbor reaches the inner face. Small stones pass through the remaining gap. Clay-rich packing follows, pressed around them in thin layers. The architecture implies repeated knowledge shared across generations. People knew how local slabs broke, how a wall settled, how wetness entered a seam, and when a wedge was doing useful work. The evidence does not identify a formal building crew or assign the labor by gender or status. Here, 2 adults are enough. You hold the outer slab while the neighbor tests the inner stone. When pressure from one side produces movement on the other, the person who feels it calls a stop. A flatter chip goes low, a rounded piece is rejected because it rolls. Fine material fills the smaller void above. Each addition reduces the movement until both faces feel firm. The cooperation is physical and immediate. One pair of hands could see only half the joint. Two people can detect what travels through it. You pass the last clay inward, then smooth your side. The neighbor does the same beyond the wall. No speech is preserved, so the action carries the exchange. Both of you push once. The wall answers with stillness. You gather the rejected stones and prepare the practical test that matters next. Carrying something through the repaired bend, the rejected chips are sorted by size. One becomes a wedge, two return to the spare pile, and the friable pieces are kept from the channel. Selection matters as much as pressure when space is limited. An empty pottery vessel is chosen for the test. It is wide enough to catch a bad projection and light enough that a collision will not waste food. You lift it against your hip and approach the repaired turn at the same angle used by a person carrying a household load. The new slab stands on your right. An older facing stone narrows the left. Passage dimensions structured daily movement between houses. Width, height, thresholds, and turns shaped how bodies met, who could pass, and how objects traveled. A repair that strengthens the wall but blocks the route would create a different defect. You turn one shoulder, lower the rim, and move through. The vessel clears the slab by about a finger's breadth. You do not convert that into a measured ancient standard. It is simply enough space for this load and this person. At the next bend, you reverse and return. The rim clears again. No clay rubs onto the pot. No packing falls. The neighbor watches the upper edge while you pass. It remains still. You set the empty vessel down inside the doorway. The test has joined structure to consequence. The wall is firmer, and the route still works. Outside, the first light wetness begins to darken the exposed clay around the repaired seam. Drops mark the ground and spread across the outer clay in irregular patches. You remain beside the joint long enough to see where the wetness travels. Stone faces, packed cavities, clay cladding, roofed passages, drains, and repeated maintenance all contributed to the settlement's practical shelter. None should be turned into an invented modern performance figure. The evidence shows construction choices and survival of fabric, not a thermometer reading inside a Neolithic house. Water reaches the upper edge of the repair and darkens the rough surface. It follows the slight fall you created, rather than gathering behind the slab. At the base, the cleared floor channel receives a thin line and carries it away. One small patch remains pale under the overlap. The clay there has not yet taken water. You resist touching it. A fresh surface needs time to settle more than it needs another anxious thumb. The neighbor stands in the passage with the empty vessel. Both of you watch one more run of water. No leak appears at the inner face. No grit falls from above. The route stays passable. That is sufficient evidence for tonight. The joint sheds wetness better than it did when your thumb first found movement. You lift the tools from the ground and prepare to make the final judgment under your palm. The adult judges by movement, touch, and the path of water. Those observations are limited, immediate, and sufficient for deciding whether to leave the repair alone. You tip the waiting container and watch the collected grit settle away from the flow. The cleared water keeps moving, giving the joint a longer test than a single splash could provide. You press the slab near its lower edge. It does not rock. Your hand moves higher, testing the seam, the overlap, and the capstone above. Skara Brae's survival can make the architecture seem permanent from the beginning. It was not. Durability grew from skilled selection, repair, replacement, packing, rebuilding, and the fortunate preservation of stone within accumulating deposits. Untouched perfection would be a poor explanation for a village occupied across centuries. The clay surface is damp but intact. The wedge holds. Water has begun to move toward the cleared channel. The neighbor reports no movement from the other face. Your verdict is small. This stone can stay. No tour is required. The result belongs to one slab, one joint, one evening of wet weather. It may need attention again after settling. Another generation may alter the passage. A later wall may cover part of the work. For now, the defect has become a stable edge. A person carrying a vessel can pass. Water has a better route. The wall carries its weight without shifting under your palm. You remove your hand and leave the new face alone. The repair has earned no monument. It has earned the more useful reward of becoming part of the wall that nobody needs to think about tonight. You stand slowly and walk the bend once without a load. Shoulder, hip, and foot clear the new edge. Only then does the passage earn the heavier test that closes the repair. The tools remain scattered near the passage turn. You rinse the flat working stone with a little water, scrape clay from its edge, and set it where the surface can dry. Spare packing pieces are sorted by size rather than discarded into the root. Flat chips go together. Small wedges occupy a shallow container. Rounded fragments are moved to a place where they cannot roll beneath a foot. Later excavation separates tools, building material, occupation debris, and animal remains into categories for study. In life, those materials crossed the same floor and passed through the same hands. A tool for cleaning a joint might return to food work only after careful attention. A broken fragment could become a useful wedge. You carry the rejected slab back to the wall where it began. It failed this repair, not every future task. Its thinner edge may suit a cover, lining, or smaller face. The neighbor brushes loose grit from the threshold. You make one final passage with empty hands, confirming that nothing projects into the shoulder line. The route is safer for the next person who comes after dark with an occupied grip. You stack the last working stone, lift the container of grit, and turn toward the house as the wetness becomes steadier. You step through the low entrance and set the grit container beside the other repair material. Behind you, water marks the ground in a continuous darkening line. The passage roof protects the narrow route. The reset slab holds the outer face. Mixed packing supports the cavity. Clay closes the seam. The shallow channel carries water from the troublesome edge. These elements work together without becoming a catalogue because each has changed what the adult did. Inside, another person touches the wall near the repair and feels no dampness arriving through the joint. The test is not conclusive for every storm or every year. It is enough for the next wet night. You close the entrance to its usual position and place the working stone away from the hearth. The heavier slab is no longer a burden in your arms. It has become part of the passage. Outside, water continues over the rough clay. It follows the overlap, reaches the base, and moves away. The story ends with a judgment rather than an architectural triumph. The slab fits. The root remains open. The wall is steady under pressure. You sit near the central fire, where no new repair is waiting, and let the sound of rain remain beyond the covered turn. In another house and another moment within the settlement's long occupation, you follow an adult beginning a quieter round. A pottery vessel is lifted from a stone-sided recess and held close enough to hear the contents shift. The pot contains grain for this carefully composite scene. Charred barley grains belong to the excavated evidence, and pottery known as grooved ware was part of life at Skara Brae. Neither fact supplies a complete seasonal menu or proves what stood in every surviving recess. The ordinary goal is narrower: find what remains usable, keep damp, ash, and careless handling from reaching it. Prepare only what is needed now. You set the vessel on a stable patch of floor and brush grit from the rim before removing the cover. The room is already descending into evening quiet. One adult works near the central hearth. Another sorts tools at the wall. No new visitor enters. A loose grain has lodged against the cover. You return it to the pot and look across the upper layer without stirring deeply. Exposure is itself a cost when stores must last. The vessel feels dry on the outside. The contents move freely. You place a small working bowl beside it and begin the first check by hand. You take a pinch between finger and thumb. The grains roll separately rather than clinging together. You press one lightly, smell your fingers, and return the rest to the vessel. Cultivated barley is established at Skara Brae, but its exact ration, preparation, and place in any one evening cannot be recovered. The scene stays with conditions a household could judge: dryness, visible damage, smell, and the familiar feel of stored material. The vessel returns the solemn silence expected from several kilograms of pottery. That is the last dry comparison in this story. The work itself becomes quieter from here. You level the disturbed patch and fit the cover promptly. A flat stone rests above it, not as a universal storage technology, but as a plausible way to secure this household's container within the scene. The grain is sound enough to keep. A small portion goes into the working bowl. The larger store remains closed. The distinction preserves more than food. It limits ash, damp air, and repeated hands around the main vessel. Whatever preparation follows will use only the amount required. You move the bowl toward the grinding surface and leave the heavy pot where it no longer needs attention. Your fingers leave a shallow mark across the leveled grain. You smooth it once, not for ceremony, but so any later disturbance will be visible before another hand reaches deep into the vessel. A worn stone surface lies near the working area. You clear it with a dry scrap, place a handful from the bowl at its center, and take up the smaller grinding stone. Querns, grinding slabs, pestles, hammerstones, and other working stones occur in records from Skara Brae. They show repeated processing and maintenance, though a single tool could have served more than one substance across its life. You begin with short strokes. The grain shifts beneath the stone and becomes coarser fragments. Only a small quantity is exposed. The main pot remains covered behind you. The work uses shoulder and wrist together. Pressure matters more than speed. A few grains escape toward the edge, and you return them with the side of your hand before continuing. No exact flour texture or recipe is claimed. You stop when the material suits the immediate household task. Whatever final preparation may follow beyond what the evidence securely permits. The ground portion goes into the smaller vessel. You brush the stone surface clean and collect the last fragments rather than leaving them for feet or ash. The grinding tool returns to its place. The larger store has remained undisturbed through most of the work, which is itself part of keeping supplies usable. The stone carries traces of earlier use in its worn hollow. Tonight's handful follows that existing surface rather than beginning a new one. The second container holds material connected with the household's animals. You move it away from the damp side of the room and check the fastening without opening it fully. Cattle and sheep or goat dominate much of the domestic animal evidence from Skara Brae, with pig also present. Bones reveal herding, slaughter, consumption, and use of animal materials across generations. They do not identify the contents of this container or turn the assemblage into one bowl. The narration therefore names no cut, recipe, or preservation method. You are checking a prepared portion whose keeping matters. The outer wrapping is secure. The place beneath it is dry. No sharp bone edge has pressed through. A worked bone tool nearby reminds us that animals contributed more than food. Bone became points, pins, beads, and other objects after careful shaping. Hides and fibers may have served clothing and coverings, though exact materials in this room are not preserved. You tighten the fastening and set the portion on a small support above a cool patch of floor. The action is enough. Animal resources form one strand of the household's winter margin. Important, but not solitary. You wash or wipe your hands in a modest, unspecified way before turning toward the container associated with work near water. The next vessel stands apart from the grain. Its cover is sound, but moisture has gathered on the stone beside it. You move it to a drier patch and inspect the rim. Fish bones from Skara Brae show that marine resources were used. Stone and bone equipment also supports fishing activity. The importance of fish in diet, the species taken at different times, and the methods of preparation have all been debated. The evidence does not justify a standard winter fish course. You keep the contents general and the work specific. The cover must exclude damp and ash. A residue on the outer wall should be cleaned before it attracts grit. The vessel should not share a wet surface with the grain store. A cloth or scrap passes around the base. You turn the pot once and set it on 2 flat chips that keep the lowest edge off the moist stone. The separation does not imply a named storeroom or a permanent rule for every house. It is a practical decision made by one adult who wants unlike tasks to remain manageable. You press the cover and listen for movement inside. Nothing shifts dangerously. The pot remains closed. The evidence stays in proportion, and the household keeps one more resource protected from the room's dampness. Beside the working stones lies a polished bone object. You lift it by the thicker end and examine the point before placing it with the awls. Some animal bone at Skara Brae came from deer. Though deer remains form a much smaller part of the assemblage than domestic cattle and sheep or goat. Evidence from the wider Skara Brae area shows that red deer could be handled in socially complex ways. That does not make hunting the center of this household's food story. Nor can the species of every worked bone object be identified by sight in a narrated scene. The point matters because it is shaped, serviceable, and ready for repair work. You run a finger along the polished shaft. A faint roughness near the base needs smoothing. The point itself is intact. You place it beside a flatter stone used for finishing. The adult at the hearth asks for a tool. You pass a different awl, leaving this one for later attention. No ownership or specialist role is assigned. The bone object has moved from animal resource to durable equipment. Its usefulness now lies in the hands that maintain it. You set the small finishing stone nearby and turn to the few perishable items waiting to be sorted. The finishing stone is drawn near enough that the rough base can be treated later without searching through the tool row. Preparation here is modest. One object, one surface, and a place where neither will be stepped on. A shallow container holds several gathered items whose exact species cannot be recovered for this night. You remove one soft piece, keep the sounder portions, and spread them briefly so damp does not collect beneath. People in Neolithic Orkney gathered plant foods and other seasonal resources alongside farming, herding, and fishing. Preservation is uneven. It would be easy to supply a confident list of berries, roots, greens, nuts, or sea plants that the evidence for this particular scene cannot support. So the language remains plain. These are gathered foods or useful plant materials. Some are still sound. One has begun to spoil. The adult knows the difference through familiarity, rather than a botanical label supplied 5,000 years later. You discard the soft piece away from stored food and wipe the container. The remaining items go back in a thinner layer. The cover is left slightly loose until surface dampness is cleared, then fitted again. This small sorting prevents one damaged piece from affecting the rest. It also keeps the mixed economy human in scale. Gathering is not an attractive list of wild flavors. It is another task of noticing what will keep. You place the container beyond the hearth sparks and return to the larger pottery vessel for a closer inspection. The pot is rotated slowly toward the hearth glow. A pale line runs along one side, beginning below the shoulder and ending before the base. Pottery fragments are abundant at Skara Brae. Some vessels were decorated, used, damaged, and discarded. The life history of an individual pot can be difficult to reconstruct, especially when only fragments survive. Repair methods are not confidently known for every crack and phase. You trace the line with a fingertip. It does not open under gentle pressure. No moisture appears along it. The mark may be a surface scratch, a firing variation, or an old shallow flaw. The contents are too valuable to risk for curiosity. You do not fill the vessel with water or strike it for sound. Instead, you move it onto a flatter support and turn the marked side away from the busiest route. A second adult steadies the pot while the cover is replaced. Both hands release slowly. The line proves superficial for now. That is not a guarantee. It is enough to decide that the vessel can remain in service under watch. You clear the floor around its base and leave the pot protected, neither discarded at the first mark nor trusted beyond what the check has shown. The polished bone point returns to your hands. A strip of material beside the resting area has begun to separate along one edge. You test the point against a less important scrap before using it. Bird and mammal bones were worked into awls, pins, beads, points, and other objects at Skara Brae. The exact function of every piece is not certain, but a sharpened, polished point clearly offered a way to pierce softer material. The test hole forms cleanly. You pass the tool through the damaged edge, making space for an existing tie or thread described no more precisely than preservation allows. Another adult holds the material taut. 3 careful piercings bring the edge back into alignment. The fastening follows. You press the repaired section between both hands and feel that the strain is now spread rather than concentrated at the tear. A tool light enough to overlook can decide whether a covering remains serviceable through repeated use. That consequence matters more than naming its maker or owner. You wipe the point, check that its tip has not bent, and return it to the row with the other bone tools. The repaired material goes back to its place. One winter supply has been preserved not by abundance, but by a few minutes of skilled maintenance. The renewed edge of the covering is folded back over itself, reducing the pull on the fresh holes. You press along the fold and hand it across only after the fastening stays level under gentle tension. A stone edge waits beside the finishing surface. It is not broken, only dulled along the portion most often used. You hold it at a shallow angle and draw it across the working stone. Flaked chert and other stone implements occur at Skara Brae, along with hammerstones, polished tools, and the debris of making or resharpening. A tool did not have to be large to carry many hours of use. You remove only what is necessary. The first stroke leaves a faint line of dust. The second evens the edge. You test it against a scrap rather than against your thumb, and find that it cuts with less pressure. A larger sharpening would shorten the tool without need. Winter economy includes the material inside useful objects, not only the food inside pots. You clean the working surface and collect the tiny flakes away from the walking route. The edge is wrapped or placed with its active side inward, where a reaching hand will not meet it by accident. Another adult returns the bone point after finishing the repair. Stone and bone lie side by side, different materials maintained for overlapping household tasks. You set the sharpened tool within reach of morning work and move toward the pottery vessel standing too close to the cool wall seam. The lower wall is darker where moisture has collected along a joint. A covered pot stands within a hand's breadth of it. You slide both palms beneath the vessel and move it toward a drier section of floor. Stone construction and packed deposits reduced exposure, but they did not abolish dampness, spills, condensation, smoke, or the ordinary risks of storing supplies in an inhabited room. A house could be substantial without becoming dry by modern expectation. 2 flat chips go beneath the pot, one at either side of the base. The vessel now rests above the darkest line and no longer leans toward the wall. You make sure the supports are stable before releasing your hands. No claim is made that every Skara Brae pot stood on raised stones, or that this was a formal storage technology. It is one cautious action within a plausible household problem. The marked line on the pot remains unchanged. The cover stays secure. Air can move around the lowest edge more readily, and any new dampness will be easier to notice. A few inches of movement may matter more than a confident theory about named storerooms. You wipe the old position, leave it empty, and turn toward the household's remaining dry supply for the hearth. The hearth supply has been divided into pieces that feel different in the hand. Some are dry and light, others carry more dampness or produce more smoke when brought near the flame. Central fires are certain at Skara Brae. The balance of peat, wood, dung, seaweed, or other fuels at a particular moment is not. Environmental conditions, access, preparation, and changing landscape all complicate a single answer. You do not name the pieces. You sort by observed behavior. The drier fragments go beneath a cover or into the more protected part of the room. One damp piece remains apart, where it can lose moisture without touching food or bedding. A person beside the hearth requests one small addition. You choose a dry piece and pass it across. It catches without producing the thicker smoke that would force another adjustment of the entrance. The remaining supply is not counted as an exact ration. It is simply enough to require care. The cleanest pieces are held back for times when the room is most occupied and smoke would be hardest to manage. You close the protected bundle and clear the fragments from the floor. Fuel uncertainty remains in the research. Practical judgment remains in the person's hands. A small pottery vessel is placed near the hearth, close enough to receive heat and far enough that its side does not meet the strongest flame. You turn it after an interval. Hearth-supported cooking, warmth, light, and craft work. But no excavated room gives an exact temperature or a timed recipe for this evening. Vessel positions changed with fire size, task, and available space. The contents are described only as a prepared portion. They warm gradually while the larger stored amount remains covered. A hand near the vessel judges heat by brief contact with the outer wall, then withdraws. You rotate the pot so one side does not bear the whole exposure. The flame has lowered, and another dry fragment is added only after the vessel settles. Nothing boils theatrically. No aroma is identified with false precision. The consequence is quieter. The portion warms without scorching. The main store remains protected from repeated opening. The hearth continues to serve several needs at once. Another adult clears a place where the vessel can be moved when ready. You lift it with a folded layer between hand and pottery, then set it on a stable stone away from bare feet. The fire receives no further change. The warmed portion rests while the room's other tasks continue. You wait until the pot stops rocking on the support, then turn its handleless body so the warmest side faces away from the walking line. The adjustment leaves one safe approach for the adult who will collect it. 3 jobs meet at the center of the room. One adult holds the repaired material and needs the bone point. Another brings the covered pot from the wall. You have the point in one hand and an empty place beside you. You pass the tool outward and receive the pot before it can obstruct the route. The third person moves the working bowl away from the hearth. In a few breaths, each task is advanced. The connected plan of the village and the close layout of a single room make cooperation plausible. Archaeology cannot recover the exact kinship, authority, or spoken rules behind it. It cannot tell us whether the exchange was expected, requested, or offered. The scene therefore avoids a formal division of labor. People simply respond to what occupies the available hands and floor. You check the pot's support and place it near the other closed vessels. The bone point returns after one final piercing. The working bowl is wiped and turned upside down. No one has become a specialist in the narration. Skilled knowledge remains distributed across actions that several people may understand. The room now contains fewer open tasks. A repaired edge is secure. A pot is protected. A tool is back in its row. You settle the last exchange and consider the temptation to combine the remaining stores into a meal the evidence has never recorded. The grain bowl, the wrapped animal portion, the vessel associated with fishing work, and the gathered materials all stand within reach. Together they make a broad picture of resources used by the community across centuries. They do not make a dated recipe book. You pause before combining anything the evidence never places together. Barley, animal bones, fish remains, shellfish, and gathered foods show breadth. They also come from different contexts, phases, and processes of preservation. A single reconstructed menu could turn that breadth into false certainty. So the household prepares only a generic portion from material already selected for use. The rest remains closed. No seasoning list appears. No exact cooking vessel is assigned beyond the pot already near the hearth. No seasonal abundance is invented. The restraint changes the action very little. You need to know what is open, what is warm, and what must be returned to storage. You do not need to name the taste. One adult takes the prepared portion. Another checks the grain cover. You secure the gathered items after their brief airing. Food remains central without becoming decorative historical cuisine. The household's concern is usability, not our appetite for detail. You wipe the edge of the working vessel and place it among the items that can be cleaned fully in better light. You count what is closed rather than what is plentiful. The grain vessel is secure. The animal portion is wrapped. The fishing-related container stands on dry supports. Gathered materials have been sorted. The hearth supply has a protected section. Then you count what is serviceable. The bone point still holds its tip. The stone edge has been sharpened. The grinding surface is clean. The covering repair bears gentle pressure without opening. Winter security can be described through the settlement's mixed economy: farming, herding, fishing, gathering, processing, preservation and tool work. Yet the margin appears most clearly in these small checks. Resources help only while they remain usable. There is no heroic feast in the room, no pot overflows. The adult does not celebrate abundance or fear immediate hunger. Such extremes would exceed the evidence and sharpen the story unnecessarily. The quieter measure is tomorrow. Will there be grain that has not dampened? A tool that does not fail at the first pull? A covering that still closes around the body? Fuel that can be tended without filling the room with smoke? Tonight's answers are adequate. You return one flat support beneath the shifted pot and make sure it bears weight evenly. The winter margin remains a set of ordinary things kept in working condition. Enough is not a number recovered from the floor. It is the practical condition created when several vulnerable things remain ready for use. A store can fail in small stages rather than one dramatic loss. The evening round answers those stages early. A damp base moved, a floor watched, a fastening tightened, a limited portion exposed and then covered. The round closes in reverse order. You return the sharpened stone edge to its protected place. The bone point lies beside the awls. The grinding stone is brushed a final time and turned so no loose material remains beneath it. The grain pot receives its cover and the flat stone above. The marked pottery vessel stands on a stable base. The damp wall position remains empty. The gathered items are sealed after their brief airing. Archaeological finds preserve the durable results of skilled hands. Tools, pots, grain, bone, and worked stone show cycles of use and repair. They do not preserve the exact sequence followed tonight, but they support a household world in which maintenance was constant. 3 possible problems have been reduced. The line on the pot proved superficial. The damp vessel moved. The worn edge became useful again. The small grinding task is complete. You wipe the working surface with the same careful economy used throughout the round. Nothing useful is left scattered. Nothing sharp points into the path. The warmed vessel has cooled enough to handle comfortably. Another adult lifts it from the stone and carries it toward the resting side of the room. You look once more at the row of closed stores. No additional container asks to be opened. The ordinary goal has been met without creating a menu the evidence cannot support. You sit back against the stone, hands empty at last. Across the room, another adult takes the warmed vessel and settles where the hearth's light is lower. The surviving evidence supports a mixed economy and a wide range of durable tools. It shows barley, domestic animals, fish, gathered resources, pottery, bone working, and stone working. It does not tell us every taste, preference, rule of sharing, or winter custom. The story ends where the evidence is strongest and the action is complete. Supplies have been inspected, a small amount has been prepared. Dampness has been noticed, tools have been maintained. No resource has been made more certain by description than excavation permits. The closed vessels remain near the wall, their contents are quiet. The repaired covering folds without strain. The hearth supply rests apart from food and bedding. The working stones no longer need hands. A person near the entrance makes one last crossing and leaves the route clear. No neighbour calls. No new problem enters. You lower your gaze from the pottery to the stone floor, and then to your resting hands. Tomorrow will require another round, but that is not a new plot. It is the ordinary continuation of the work already understood. For now, the stores are in order, and the warmed vessel has reached the people who need it. Before visitors arrive, a present-day custodian walks the raised route around the excavated houses. The morning light is low, and the stone surfaces still hold the darker tones of recent damp. Most people view Skara Brae from managed paths and walkways, rather than crossing the ancient floors at will. Access protects vulnerable masonry and deposits, while allowing the plan to remain legible. The custodian's first task is ordinary. Check barriers, panels, and labels before the site opens. One label has lifted at a corner. Another carries a thin trail of grit from the previous day. The custodian presses the corner flat, wipes the surface, and reads each sentence from the position a visitor will occupy. The work has a larger consequence. Every label stands between vivid stone and an easy story. A central hearth looks like a hearth. A tall slab arrangement looks like furniture. A narrow passage feels intimate. Familiarity can make interpretation seem certain before the evidence has earned it. The custodian's goal is not to make the place vague. It is to make the distinction visible. This is the stone that survives. This is the name archaeologists commonly use. This is the function that may be possible. This is what remains unknown. The route continues toward the panel describing the storm of 1850. At the edge of the walkway, the custodian stops beside the account of Skara Brae's exposure. A severe storm in 1850 stripped sand from part of the bay and revealed substantial ancient structures. The event matters. It led to investigation and eventually to the site known today. Yet the simplest version can sound as though the village entered human knowledge in one dramatic instant, untouched and unnoticed until the wind uncovered it. Historic accounts are less tidy. Debate remains about local awareness, earlier notices, and exactly what the storm revealed. Later excavation and reconstruction also changed what could be seen. The responsible wording is therefore precise without being theatrical. The custodian reads the revised line, "Ancient structures were exposed after the storm of 1850. It does not claim that nobody had known of ruins before then. It does not describe a Neolithic final night. It does not confuse the 19th century storm with the unknown end of village occupation around the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. A loose grain of sand rests along the panel frame. The custodian brushes it away. The exposure story now begins modern investigation without pretending to explain prehistoric abandonment. One storm belongs securely to 1850. The last centuries of village life remain a different and unresolved question. The custodian moves to the early plan mounted beside it. The early plan records chambers opened during investigations associated with William Watt of Scale and visiting antiquaries between the 1850s and 1860s. Lines mark walls, passages, and compartments that had emerged from the sand. Those investigators worked before modern archaeological recording standards. They exposed stonework, recovered objects, interpreted rooms, and in places rebuilt or altered masonry. Their records are valuable, but the site they handed forward was not unchanged by their work. The custodian follows one drawn wall with a finger held above the glass. The line corresponds partly with stone visible today, and partly with an arrangement modified by later excavation or conservation. That is why an old plan serves two histories at once. It records ancient structures as 19th century observers encountered them. It also records the choices, assumptions, and physical interventions of those observers. The panel does not condemn early work by applying standards that did not yet exist. It simply refuses to treat the drawing as a transparent window into 3000 BCE. A caption beside the plan identifies the investigation period and notes that interpretation and presentation evolved afterward. The custodian checks that the wording does not imply complete excavation or an untouched floor. The plan remains on display because uncertainty is easier to understand when the history of looking is made visible. The custodian compares the drawn wall line with the surviving stone before approving the caption. Where the two differ, the label explains the record rather than making the old plan silently authoritative. A faded reproduction of an early guide describes the settlement as Pictish, placing it thousands of years later than current evidence supports. The custodian reads the sentence and then the correction beside it. Early investigators lacked radiocarbon dating and worked with limited comparative collections. Some regarded the structures as early historic or Pictish. Pottery studies and later scientific dating eventually established that Skara Brae belonged to the Neolithic, with occupation extending broadly from the late 4th into the middle 3rd millennium BCE. The change was not a minor adjustment to a calendar. It transformed the questions asked of the site. The houses no longer belonged to a world with written references nearby. They became evidence for farming communities living in Orkney long before local texts. The custodian replaces a vague phrase that says experts discovered the true date. The new wording explains that dating changed through comparative archaeology, excavation, and radiocarbon evidence. No exact founding day appears. Current chronological models offer probability ranges and phases, not an anniversary. The faded guide remains useful. It shows that interpretation can be sincere, influential, and wrong. The corrected panel does not mock the earlier scholars. It shows how evidence changed the answer. The custodian closes the case and walks toward the photograph from the 1928 excavation. In the photograph, Vere Gordon Child stands among exposed stone during the campaign that began in 1928. His work brought Skara Brae to international attention and produced the first major modern account of the settlement. Child and his team recorded houses, passages, drains, floor deposits, pottery, tools, ornaments, animal remains, and the sequence then visible. His publication remains essential to the history of research. It also carried language and social conclusions shaped by its time. The custodian reads a quotation already shortened for the panel, then removes an old caption that repeats the word primitive without explanation. Neolithic residents were not failed versions of modern people. Their architecture, tools, farming, and social lives deserve description on their own evidence. Other child interpretations also require distance. Familiar-looking rooms encouraged confident assignments of beds, dressers, women's sides, men's sides, workshops, and communal spaces. Some labels remain useful. The social rules attached to them often do not. The revised panel keeps both facts in view. Child's excavation was foundational. Later archaeology changed chronology, phases, environmental context, and caution around room function. The custodian straightens the photograph so its lower edge sits level. The image remains central, not as the final word, but as a documented stage in learning how to read the village. A second photograph shows Margaret Simpson working at Skara Brae. Her name once appeared only in smaller print beneath Child's. The custodian removes the old caption and fits a corrected one. Simpson participated in the excavations and became Scotland's first professional female archaeologist in 1930. Naming her does not require an invented personal scene or a claim that one worker alone transformed the site. It restores a documented person to the history of archaeological labour. The new caption identifies her role plainly. It avoids describing her as merely an assistant in a way that erases expertise, and it avoids turning the correction into a heroic exception detached from the team and institution around her. The custodian checks the date, spelling, and alignment. A visitor reading the panel will now encounter more than the director's name. This is another kind of honest label. Archaeological interpretation depends on people who draw plans, lift deposits, catalogue finds, compare objects, and maintain records. Their contributions can disappear when a single famous name stands for the whole campaign. The photograph does not reveal Simpson's thoughts during the work. The panel does not supply them. It gives the secure facts: her presence, her professional role, and her place in Scottish archaeology. The custodian smooths the caption and continues toward the account of later excavation. The next panel turns to the campaigns of 1972 and 1973. Directed by David Clark and Anna Ritchie, their work returned to questions that earlier excavation could not answer securely, including chronology, environmental evidence, and the sequence of structures. The later excavations did not erase Child's plan. They worked beside it, tested assumptions, recovered material with different methods, and clarified that the settlement contained multiple phases. Buildings had changed, passages had been renewed, and not every visible wall belonged to one simultaneous village. The custodian places a transparent layered plan over the earlier drawing. As the sheet settles, one wall remains constant while another divides into separate phases. A blocked opening appears beneath a later surface. That visual sequence does what a simple label cannot. It shows interpretation growing through comparison, rather than replacing one neat story with another. The panel mentions environmental sampling only briefly. It does not follow laboratories or methods away from the human task. The next sentence returns to the excavators deciding where a wall ended and a later deposit began. The custodian checks the legend. Early, later, uncertain, and reconstructed are distinct categories. Visitors will see that current understanding rests on accumulated records, including the limitations of past campaigns. The custodian lowers the transparent sheet and moves to the short note on radiocarbon chronology. One color on the overlay marks a relationship that remains uncertain. The custodian leaves it uncertain because a useful public plan can guide the eye without pretending that every junction has been settled. The chronology panel is deliberately brief. It explains that radiocarbon determinations were combined with archaeological relationships to model when phases of activity were likely to begin and end. Skara Brae became an important early case in Bayesian archaeological chronology. The method produces probability ranges shaped by both measurements and stratigraphic information. It does not produce an exact date on which a household moved in or a final person closed a doorway. The custodian reads the main range aloud under the breath. Occupation broadly from the late 4th millennium BCE to around the middle of the 3rd. More detailed models narrow particular transitions, but the public wording keeps approximately where approximately belongs. A previous draft had converted a modeled boundary into a single year. That sentence is removed. Precision can be attractive on a panel because it appears authoritative. When the evidence is probabilistic, false precision is simply a more polished error. The revised note also allows for more than one occupation phase and possible gaps or changes in use. It keeps chronology connected to rebuilding rather than presenting the settlement as continuously unchanged. The custodian checks that the date around 2500 BCE describes the broad end of village life, not a catastrophe scheduled for that year. The panel now offers useful time without pretending that probability is a calendar appointment. Inside the reconstructed display, the tall slab arrangement opposite the doorway receives its most familiar name: dresser. The custodian stands before the label and compares its wording with the stone form. The resemblance is strong. Uprights support shelves or ledges. Modern furniture in a similar position might hold valued objects. Historic Environment Scotland allows that special items may have been stored or shown on these ledges. The problem begins when perhaps disappears. A visitor can move from familiar shape to exact household function in a single glance. The custodian keeps the useful nickname in quotation marks. The next sentence says that the feature may have held or displayed objects, while its precise role is unknown and may have changed through time. No gendered ownership is assigned. No claim is made that every house displayed the same valuables. The label does not decide that the feature was ceremonial merely because it occupies a prominent position. The stone remains vivid without those additions. Its slabs are real. Its placement is real. Objects were found in the settlement, including ornaments and tools. The social meaning of arranging them here is an inference. The custodian presses the new card into its holder. The word dresser stays, but the uncertainty now has equal space. The next card concerns the slab-sided recesses and the floor boxes. The card beside the slab-sided recesses begins with two familiar terms: box bed and tank. The custodian reads past them to make sure analogy has not become certainty. The stone enclosures along the walls resemble bed spaces, and sleeping use is plausible. Soft bedding does not survive. The plan cannot identify individual sleepers, assign one side by gender, or show whether the same space kept the same function through every phase of a house. The floor boxes present a similar problem. Some were made watertight with clay. They have been called tanks or limpet boxes, and one proposal links them to preparing limpets for fish bait. The form and sealing are evidence. The precise activity remains interpretation. An older sentence says that women slept on one side while men slept on the other, with bait prepared in the tank between tasks. The custodian removes it. Familiar floor plans do not preserve household instructions. The replacement wording separates each level. Stone-sided recesses survive. They may have served as sleeping places. Watertight boxes survive. Fish bait preparation is one suggested use. Other functions or changing uses remain possible. The card becomes slightly longer and much more accurate. The custodian places it beside the features and checks that the labels help orientation. Without deciding lives the stones cannot fully reveal. On the plan, Structure 8 stands apart from the more regular domestic houses. It has a central hearth, but lacks the familiar dresser and slab-sided arrangements. Finds and deposits include flaked stone, clay, ash, and heat-affected stones. These differences led to its common interpretation as a workshop or craft building. The idea is reasonable. It is also debated. Questions remain about the structure's date, sequence, activities, and relationship to nearby houses. The custodian studies the current caption. The first line says Structure 8 was the village workshop. That verb carries more certainty than the evidence. A new line replaces it. Structure the 8th of May have been used for specialized craft work. The following sentence explains which features informed the interpretation. The label also notes that other readings and chronological questions remain. The adjustment does not make the building less interesting. A different plan and unusual assemblage still invite attention. The honest question is what kinds of work could have produced them, not how to force every find into one fixed room name. The custodian checks that no blacksmith, potter, or named specialist has been invented. No schedule of production appears. Structure 8 can be treated as distinctive without being made to confess a single occupation. The plan stays on the wall, and the words may have remain where they are needed. The display keeps the distinctive finds beside the cautious wording. Visitors can see why the interpretation arose, while the sentence still allows another explanation to remain possible. A paved area once carried the confident name Marketplace in Child's interpretation. The custodian reaches its panel and reads the older wording preserved in a small history of research section. Few finds established a commercial function. The name grew from an attempt to make the layout familiar and socially legible. It is valuable now as evidence for how archaeologists once imagined the settlement, not as proof of a Neolithic square devoted to trade. The main label uses the neutral phrase paved area. A smaller note explains that Child called it the marketplace and that the interpretation is no longer accepted as demonstrated. Nothing is lost by removing certainty. Visitors can still see paving, surrounding walls, and routes through the site. They can ask how the space was used while understanding that the surviving evidence does not answer fully. The custodian deletes an illustration showing a busy exchange scene. It had added people, goods, and rules of trade unsupported by the finds. A simpler plan takes its place. The words marketplace remain only within quotation marks and historical context. They describe an idea in 20th century archaeology. The custodian stands back. The paved stones look no emptier for losing an invented market. Their silence is now properly attached to the limits of the record rather than filled by a familiar modern institution. The layered plan is the most important panel on the route. Different tones separate early walls, later houses, blocked entrances, renewed passages, and uncertain relationships. The custodian checks each caption against the legend. No sentence should invite a visitor to imagine every visible room occupied at once. The extant settlement is a composite of building phases, selected by excavation and conservation. Some early structures were more freestanding. Later houses became closely set within accumulated deposits and linked passages. Buildings fell out of use, changed shape, or were replaced. The visible furniture belongs to particular phases, not to one timeless village plan. A transparent overlay shows one doorway disappearing beneath later stone. Another line marks a passage renewed after an earlier arrangement. The image makes change visible without requiring a dense chronology. The custodian adjusts the overlay so the phases align. A slight shift would turn two separate walls into one and quietly reintroduce the frozen village mistake. When the sheet sits correctly, the settlement appears active across centuries. People repaired, rebuilt, reused, and sometimes abandoned parts while life continued elsewhere. That movement matters for every domestic interpretation. A feature called a bed or dresser may have been used differently as a house changed. The custodian secures the overlay and walks toward the final history panel, where the end of occupation must remain unresolved. The plan also protects the people of different generations from being compressed into one household. Their walls may touch in the drawing while their lives remain separated by time. The last panel once showed a wall of sand sweeping across the settlement as every resident fled. The image offered a memorable conclusion and more confidence than the evidence allows. No one knows exactly why village life ended. Occupation ended broadly near the midpoint of the 3rd millennium BCE. Proposals include episodes of sand movement, environmental change, shifts in farming or landscape, wider social transformation, and gradual decisions to live elsewhere. A single catastrophic abandonment is only one older possibility. The custodian removes the dramatic image. In its place is a quieter sequence. Changing deposits, altered buildings, and a final range rather than a final night. The text says that the settlement's end remains uncertain and may have been gradual. It does not deny severe weather in Orkney. It separates possible environmental pressures from a Pompeii-like scene that excavation cannot demonstrate. No household is shown leaving possessions in panic. No last resident closes a door on an exact date. The composite winter evening from the title story belongs somewhere within centuries of occupation, not at the edge of an invented disaster. The custodian reads the final sentence twice. The village ceased to be inhabited, but the evidence does not preserve one cause. The open ending is not a failure of history. It is the responsible boundary of what the site can presently support. A smaller note near the exit mentions that no weapons have been identified among the finds from Skara Brae. An earlier version followed with the claim that the community was peaceful. The custodian deletes that second sentence. Absence is evidence of what has not been recovered in the excavated assemblage. It is not proof that violence never occurred, that conflict was unknown, or that all relations within and beyond the settlement were harmonious. Perishable weapons may not survive. Stone or bone objects can have several uses. Social behavior cannot be read directly from a missing category. The revised note remains narrow. No objects confidently identified as weapons have been found at the site. It adds that this does not establish the character of the community's social relations. The same discipline applies elsewhere. A floor plan does not prove gendered space. A paved area does not prove a market. A distinctive building does not prove one permanent workshop. A dramatic storm does not prove the manner of abandonment. The custodian does not replace a romantic picture with a darker one. There is no reason to invent violence either. The task is to leave the evidence at its proper strength. The note slides back into its frame, with the final overstatement removed. The custodian returns along the route toward the central hearth and narrow passage. The final label now separates three things cleanly: what was recovered, what has not been found, and what cannot be concluded from either condition. The custodian reads it once and leaves it unchanged. Before opening time, the custodian stops where the view gathers three enduring forms: a central hearth, a narrow covered passage, and the tall slab feature conventionally called a dresser. Each is vivid for a different reason. The hearth preserves direct evidence of fire at the center of domestic space. The passage preserves close movement between houses. The dresser preserves a carefully built form whose precise function remains open. The labels now match those differences. They do not flatten everything into uncertainty, and they do not make every familiar shape a solved room. Evidence, inference, modern naming, and the unknown stand beside one another. Beyond the root, the fitted stone remains where generations built and rebuilt around it. The floors carry traces of work, food, tools, fire, water, and repeated movement. The stones answer many practical questions and refuse others. The custodian checks the final barrier, folds the cleaning cloth, and puts away the spare label cards. The site is ready for visitors. The payoff is not that archaeology knows nothing. It is that careful limits make knowledge more trustworthy. A hearth can be called a hearth, a passage can be followed, a dresser can stay in quotation marks. The custodian turns toward the entrance as the first people approach, leaving the rooms vivid precisely because they have not been forced to explain every life once lived within them. The vessel rests where you placed it, broadside dim beside the wall. The low passage has already been crossed, the turn negotiated, the weight released from your arms. Inside, the walking strip remains clear. Wet covering stays apart from dry. Small tools lie beyond the bedding. No one needs the same patch of floor. You let the completed movements remain completed. Stone supports the vessel. The lid stays settled. Firelight narrows across the rim, then fades. The room keeps the order made by patient hands. The hearth glow has drawn inward. You have already watched the smoke, chosen the careful addition, and waited until the flame steadied. Nothing more is required from the fire. A hand withdraws from the warmth. A covering shifts once and becomes still. Across the floor, pots remain clear of the root. The bone point and sharpened edge rest where reaching fingers will find them later. For now, the central stones hold a small red light, and the familiar room settles around it. The repaired slab holds its chosen angle. Its weight belongs to the wall now, not to lifted arms. Grit has been cleared from the passage, spare stones set aside, and the channel left open. Water has already followed the easier way. No hand tests the seam again. You remember the careful lowering, the small adjustment, the final touch along the clay. Each movement has ended. The narrow route remains empty, its dark turn joining one quiet space to another. Closed vessels stay beside the stone ledges. Their covers remain in place. The repaired covering lies smooth within the fixed stone spaces, and the small bundle no longer crosses the floor. Opposite the doorway, the tall stone feature keeps its familiar outline without needing another label. The floor box and wall recesses remain equally still. You leave each thing as the evening left it: a surface, a boundary, a container, a tool put away. Low light softens their edges without changing them. The last ember brightens and lowers. Its light touches the hearthstone, the nearest pot, and the open strip of floor. Beyond the doorway, the covered passage remains connected and empty. The vessel is home. The tools are put away. The coverings have settled. The repaired slab holds, and the stored food remains closed. You let the room grow dim without asking it for another answer. Stone stays beside stone. The ember lowers once more, and the household's finished work rests quietly around it.